Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Tonight's story, Nuts of Unity. Hello there. I promised during one of our roundups on the scrapbook to tell you the story of the Royal Order of the Nuts of Unity. And tonight we have the scrapbook open to that story of a small town tomfoolery and skullduggery that tells more of its own story as it paints a cross-section of the ways of a small section of residents of Grays Harbor back in the sawdust days. So, when Dick has had a few words from our sponsors, we'll unreel the story of the small town pranksters who gave the town a chuckle at the expense of a rural visitor and found a local fun maker fraternity that thrived and was active back in the gay 90s. Here we go. First, a few words from Dick Crombie and our sponsor. In telling newcomers of the early Grays Harbor, we have tried to describe the part played by its residents in creating their own amusement. Old-timers can recall what it was like before the days of motion pictures, when the Acme Theater played an occasional road show in Aberdeen, and the old Hoquiam Theater had a short season of traveling troupes of road shows to break the monotony. And other than that, the Opera House played patent medicine shows and amateur nights almost exclusively. Lodges and fraternal organizations were popular sources of entertainment. Almost everyone belonged to at least 2 or 3 lodges that met every week, and you could count on most of the members being on hand when the Tyler had passed the brothers and sisters through the mystic gates. Churches had dinners and socials, as they do today, but much more frequently, and the whole town turned out for a ball game. No automobiles competed for the residents' time. Newspapers were weekly affairs. Magazines were scarcer than hen's teeth, and a trip out of town, even to Westport on a steamer, was an account for by only important business or a holiday. So the people of the town made their own fun, and that's what the group of male residents did in the back room of L.L. Malley's Cigar Factory on Heron Street. Malley's Cigar Factory, for those who haven't heard of its wondrous spot in Aberdeen, was the home of such fragrant nickel smokes as the White Squadron and the Think of Me cigars. Bales of tobacco were delivered by the Aberdeen Livery and Transfer Company to the back door and carted in by Malley's crew of cigar makers. At a row of tables down through the back room, the skillful leaf twister sat with an open cigar box at one hand and a pile of leaf and filler at the other. The tobacco moved across the table through their tangled fingers from a cut leaf to the finished cigar in a few deft movements. When the box was packed, the maker rose from the front chair and stacked it in the growing pile on the counter. Men all over the Northwest smoked the Think of Me cigars. Many men smoked the White Squadron, never regarding by its makers a superior smoke, never the answer to what this country needed, but a lot of cigar for the money. It was generally agreed. The cigar makers started at 7 in the morning. It was the age of the 10-hour workday. They were through at 6 o'clock at night. And when they trudged out the door of Malley's Cigar Shop, where many of the town cigar smokers came to buy their favorite brand fresh from the factory, the room stood empty and quiet, but not for long. Because after dinner was over in the wooden houses and the small hotels along the sawdust and slab-built streets, there was a small cloister of men about town who gathered in the back room of Malley's cigar store. Along with Doc Payne's drugstore, it was the town's clubhouse. There they argued religion, held political meetings, talked strong business, and planned some of the town's most surprising promotions. If it could be compared with anything today, it might be a combination of the office of the Chamber of Commerce and the 10 o'clock coffee clutches that meet around town on an average morning. Now, let's get on with the other end of the story. Most of the families who flocked to the lumber regions of the harbor were Michigan folk, and to many of them, the Royal Order of the Knots of Unity were well known. It had been organized and formed in the lumber region of the Midwestern states and would be a joiner who refused membership. Moreover, it had become quite a fraternal entity in the land and time where most anyone could start a lodge and someone would join it. Now, the little group that met each other in the back room of Mally's cigar store was a far cry from a lodge. It had no fraternal interest. In fact, the informal atmosphere of the back room of the cigar factory was probably the reason that these Grays Harborites gathered there. They could come as they were. If they were in working clothes, they were welcome as though they were in a dance hall at the Elks Temple upstairs over Wolf's store. And the lack of formality extended to their activities. The late stayers on a Saturday night might make the rounds of the town's bars before they gave up for the evening. And there was nothing that they enjoyed more than a practical joke. It was the spice that took the humdrum out of the damp and endless days of the frontier town, where nothing seemed to happen but an occasional waterfront brawl or a new barn raising, and practical joking became one of the ends of the men who frequented Mally's back room. They became famous for their pranks. It was this group of jokers who convinced the late Edward C. Finch that he could whip Charlie Johnson, the toughest saloon operator in town, and the operator of one of the town's most notorious dance halls. They were the ones who helped Ed home after Charlie Johnson had thoroughly settled the issue. All true. It was this cloister of jokers that built a knothole in the wall of Tom Taylor's room with asphodite and made the town's best-dressed man move his lodgings. And laughing, they often referred to themselves as the Nuts of Unity, a play word inspired by Michigan's lodge, with which all were acquainted. And then there was the time that Mr. Olson blew in from Oakville. It was a warm afternoon in June, and Mally stood in his shirt sleeves in front of his cigar store. Heron Street stirred lazily when Bill Mogman of the Northern Pacific Express Company drove down the planking streets with a truck of his new arrival. But it did not stir itself enough to pay attention to the little man who hurried fruitily along the plank sidewalk, looking at signs on doors and windows over the top of his glasses. He stopped to study Mally's. The manager politely asked if he could help locate somebody. The little man introduced himself as Mr. Olson from Oakville. He had come all the way from Oakville to find a detective. It was a personal matter, strictly personal. But as he chatted on, he told Mally his whole life story. He suspected his wife of showing affections to another resident in Oakville. He wanted evidence. The detective would be retained to provide the evidence. As he talked, rattling away with the absorption and the sound of his own voice, Mally had an idea. Finally, he popped the idea to the newcomer. There is, said the cigar manufacturer, an organization here in Aberdeen that trains men for detective work. It's a secret order, he confided, but good men and true could be obtained and could have membership, particularly if they had a personal problem such as Mr. Olson. And if Mr. Olson wanted further information, he should come back that evening, say about 9 o'clock. Mally informed the Oakville resident that the president of the organization was usually available at the cigar store at about that time. The salesman argument was a winner. Mr. Olson announced that he would be back promptly at 9. Now, to know how the story could possibly develop from here, it is necessary to know something about the men who haunt the back room of the cigar factory. They were men such as Jim Heron, Jim had come west to see the 10 lots that he had sunk his money into out in Grays Harbor City. He saw them up on the hillside, but never realized a cent from them. And Jim went busted along with the Grays Harbor City bubble. There was Grove Antrim, who kept books and confidences and enjoyed a good joke. There was Ed Finch, whose promotional mind had little time to plan a practical joke, but who was ready to participate when someone else had laid out the plot. There was Clyde Weatherwax, a hail fellow who relished in the rowdy turn of pranks that they played. There were others unrecorded, but all of the same stamp. Jim Heron turned up first that evening, and Mally unreeled the tale. Jim agreed to be the president of the Majestic Order of Unity, a training school for detectives. He hurried to Doc Payne's drugstore and picked out a pair of thick glasses from the stock that the doctor had at the counter. He filled a curved-stem pipe with Mally's stock and pulled his hat down over his eyes as 2 or 3 others arrived. Mally retold the story. A plan as thorough and factitious had never been conjured and was quickly put into effect. The backroom boys scattered to carry out their respective parts to play in it. When Olson arrived at Mally's cigar store, Mally engaged him in conversation at the front counter of the retail store. But in the back room, the members of the Order of Unity were frantically turning the cigars maker's shop into the headquarters of a mystical cult. Finally, Jim Heron, who had sneaked out the back door, entered in the front. He was introduced to Olson as the president of the organization, and for his benefit, Olson related his entire story. Heron agreed that the training as a detective would be a good course of action, and, of course, the certification of detectivehood that went with the graduation would qualify the Oakville resident to do his own sleuthing. But did Olson have qualifications? The out-of-towner listed his talents, his backgrounds, and produced evidence of his connections with well-known residents of the county. Finally, Heron agreed that was a special concession. The order would meet at 10 o'clock to conduct Olson through the course of training. The Oakville man left the cigar store with a list of essentials to purchase before that time. He was to have dark glasses, a false beard to match his natural walrus mustache, and a magnifying glass. He was to return promptly at 10 p.m. And now a few words from our sponsor. Well, at 10 o'clock, the candidate for initiation to the Order of Unity returned. He was promptly conducted into a dimly lit room behind the cigar store, where hooded figures conducted him on the roughest rituals any detective ever faced. He was tricked, bamboozled, and abused. He was questioned, lectured, and confused. It was a kangaroo court combined with an inquisition. He was relieved of a $5 membership fee and presented with a mysterious scroll containing the words and writings he could not even understand. Finally, he was held before the President Heron and advised that if he returned the next night and passed his examination, he would receive his badge and certificate, and then was turned out into the waterfront Aberdeen at midnight. The streets were dark, the shadows heavy, and as he walked towards his lodgings at Sargent's Hotel, he was followed by howling laughter. Shadowy forms seemed to slink after him. A barrel rolled out from between the 2 buildings and narrowly missed him. His walk became a dog trot. Then, as 2 shots were fired, he broke into a dead run. As he arrived at the hotel, now dark, 2 hooded forms stood at the front door. He reversed his field and ran back down along the city's tangled waterfront. The voices followed him. There were screams, wild laughter, outcries, then the sound of running feet behind him. Reserving his field again, the man from Oakville dashed from Heron Street Bridge and hurried across its rumbling planking, heading east. The membership of the Order of Unity, that the town was to eventually blame for the mysterious noises of that night, sat down to catch their breath in front of O'Hare's saloon. And the snooper from upcountry, he never showed up in Aberdeen again, so far as anyone could learn. And the next morning the cigar makers had to move a packing box of odd paraphernalia before they could start their work at their tables, while residents of Aberdeen asked each other if they heard the mysterious sounds from the night before. Of course, when word got around that the little man, disheveled and weary, had caught the Montesano boat at Cosmopolis that morning, the story was too good to keep, and the membership of the Nuts told the yarn of the ghostly welcome in the kangaroo court all over town. And folks got a chuckle at the practical joke, and an old-timer recalled it the other day as one of those events out of the harbors long ago past that ought to have a page in tonight's Hometown Scrapbook. Thanks for listening.